Hello, well, this is Dr. Dave Maslock talking about reciprocity.com. The E is spelled with a 3, where I truly do believe that you should be able to get all the feedback, skills, and amazement, wonder required to become a prolific writer and a scholar. In this particular video, I wanted to talk to you about making mistakes in research. This happens to us all the time. I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and we make mistakes all the time. This is a really common thing. In fact, it is a really stressful and anxiety-inducing thing. We all feel like this. When you write something up, and maybe it's actually a published article that you find, oh, darn it, right? Like I should have done something. Maybe it's something that you actually went through and you're writing up. And this is part of my own experience. This week I was actually working on a paper and I was going through the review process, and I realized there were some numbers on there. I was like, this looks really strange and peculiar. I was like, how can that possibly be that large compared to what normally is seen in the literature? And I was like, this is really weird and strange and highly unusual. Now, this happens all the time. And in fact, it is a real crisis in what's going on in science right now. It's what's called the replication crisis, right? That there is this problem. So one of the basic sort of foundational understandings with science is that we should be able to replicate any particular study that there is, any sort of scientific result that there is. And it should be written in such a way that your article is written in such a way that anybody can sort of follow along and replicate that as much as possible. Now, there's a lot of different reasons why this is not the case and why it's difficult to do this. I'm going to give you a couple of them. The first one is when you're going through the review process, you sort of have to write the article. You're asked to write in different ways when you're writing an article. It's as much as you want to sort of stick to the truth of what's going on, and we do stick to the truth of what's possibly going on. It's a really difficult process because we're often asked to go in different ways. So I'm a learning scholar. I study how people learn and make sense of things and make inferences of things. And what you actually do as a scholar, and what the reviewers go through, and what the journal editor goes through along the process, we assume with the sort of replication story is that we know absolutely everything at the beginning. And in fact, that is not true, because science is a learning process. It's all about learning and understanding things in a different way. So what ends up happening is you or the reviewers or the editors, you'll learn something at the beginning. You're like, I want to go study that and figure it out. You go study it and get some sort of results, and you realize that the results are different than what you thought. And then you have to learn and sort of make sense of what's going on. And then what you end up getting is a completely different study, and you're getting pushed in different ways, and that you realize you didn't sort of understand what was going on. You realize halfway through you didn't understand what's going on, and then you sort of try to make this sense up as you go, and then you put that into the particular paper. And then what this ends up happening in some people actually really don't like this, because this is sort of hypothesizing after the results are known, so it's called harking. But the tricky thing is, and those people that are acknowledging that sort of harking is a problem, they're going to acknowledge to themselves, and they're not going to tell a lot of other people. But harking is sort of it's not necessarily a problem, because what it is telling you, it's telling a story of this learning process of what's going on. You're actually learning, the reviewers are learning, everybody is learning along the way, and you have to make that sort of that study and things as clear as you possibly can before it actually gets published. That's really a requirement of why things get published, is because it's clear and it makes sense along the way, that you couldn't possibly actually get to that point unless you were pushed and people sort of made you think of different ways. The reviewers made you think in different ways. And when that happens, you have to sort of change the story, change the framing of the paper, and it becomes a kind of a different study at that point. And that could be considered harking along the way. But what that doesn't acknowledge with the sort of idea of what's going on is that there's so much subjectivity along the way. And this is because we're learning, right? We don't understand the world, and we don't understand truly understand what's going on. And that is the big myth that I'm sort of breaking here, is that scientists We are discovering a world every day that is really difficult and complicated, and there's so many different things along the way. We have to make a lot of decisions that are really difficult, and it would be kind of unproductive to actually sit down and, systematically write down all of these decisions of how they actually occurred. There's so many little decisions that happen along the way. And what we have to do is called tacit knowledge. We have to rely on what's called tacit knowledge. People have studied this from the 1960s, and we have to rely on that tacit knowledge to actually come up with something that is, that makes sense of the world. And what is tacit knowledge? This is where that there is, scientists have a subjective understanding of the world, and they can't necessarily codify everything as they write down everything in all this sort of little steps along the way. In fact, it's difficult, impossible to do, because scientists often have this tacit knowledge. And if you ask them to write down all of those particular steps, you're going to sort of erode this understanding, and we're not going to make nearly as many large leaps as we possibly can in the scientific effort if we actually have to do that. Now, I'm not suggesting that greater precision and focused on acknowledging the the subjectivity of science is a bad thing. I think that's absolutely wonderful that people are actually raising this at this point. This was kind of the dirty little secret in science, that we were considered sort of understanding the almighty, thing about the world that happened. In fact, I would be the first one to say that science was almost becoming a religion, in the sense that we couldn't attack it. We couldn't sort of bring it down, sort of different understandings down. We couldn't say one particular study was problematic or not. And we couldn't advance science very well until this sort of replication crisis was brought to the fore. We began to understand that, in fact, it actually is really difficult to replicate things because of all these different understandings and the sort of tacit knowledge that happens along the way, the subjectivity of science that happens along the way. The one thing that I am sort of raising, and that I'm very concerned with what's going on, is that there's some unproductive norms that are going on in the scientific community right now that is affecting the psychological safety of scientists. And I'm really, really nervous about this. And this is something that we should truly address. Coming back to, there's some very well-known scientists out there that their careers have been destroyed, such as, for example, Amy Cuddy's scientific efforts. Now, she was the one that talked about faking it till you make it. She had a TED Talk and became very famous. And the science was flawed. And we probably do know that the science is flawed. But the way that the arguments eroded, and the way that they sort of developed over time, they were kind of not the best way that they actually developed. The sort of scientific norms of attacking somebody if it's not necessarily the best. I'm very concerned about that. That's something in my gut that I am very concerned. It's not the fact that, my research is any better than anybody else's. I'm going to say that, there is a lot of decisions you have to make along the way, and it's really difficult to make those decisions along the way. And in fact, we're all flawed. And I think that's the one way that we can navigate this problem, is just realize and acknowledge that we as scientists, we as researchers, we're all flawed. We're all navigating this particular problem. And you have to come at it at a base of humility to realize that, we don't know what we're doing as much as somebody else can. And if something gets really popular and it starts to grow and the ideas start to spread, well, we have to acknowledge, we have to be very, very careful that idea is couched, and we realize that there is so many caveats along the way that it only sort of applies to one particular context. For example, it only applies to this certain type of data that we actually have, because often what ends up happening is we gather new data, we gather new insights, we measure things in a different way, and we get completely different results. Things change completely. We look at things in a new setting, and we get completely different insights along the way. And the other thing that we have to really, truly acknowledge when you're making, so we make shit up, right? So scientists actually make shit up. We're developing new theories, and that's really what it is. When you develop new theories, theories, you're dreaming in new possible ways that nobody else has dreamt before, and you truly are. You're the only person that's actually doing something like this in the world. You might have a subset of scholars that you acknowledge, and maybe there's 50, maybe there's 100 people, maybe in the broader sense there's 1,000 people that are doing similar things that you're doing, but that is it. That's the number of people that are actually doing it. And the problem is that you're the only person that's actually working on that one little tiny thing, and that you're pushing the envelope on that one little tiny thing. So you're trying to constantly move into this uncertain area that is really difficult to navigate. And it is tricky. We are flawed. We make mistakes. We think in the wrong way. That is being a human being. In fact, that's one thing that I study repeatedly. And there's been Nobel laureates, Dick Thaler, for example, the most recent one, 2017. Herbert Simon, for example. There has been, now I'm blanking on a couple of other ones, but there's been a lot of people as of late that have looked at this and suggested that human beings are really flawed and scientists are really flawed. We make mistakes all the time. We are not machines. We can't compute things as best as we possibly try, and as best as we try to include as much information as we possibly can, and look at the world in all these different ways and try to forecast the world as much as we possibly can. We are flawed. And we have to acknowledge that we have to be very humble that we are scientists and we don't know what we're doing. And we have to be very careful about that and realize when we see somebody else making mistakes along the way that we're being very humble and we're acknowledging and helping them and realizing, that they're our friends. You got to put your hand over their shoulder and sort of help them and push them forward to sort of think in a different way, rather than simply just discarding them and eroding their confidence and really attacking that particular individual and removing all of those bad feelings that we have in science and acknowledging we're just all together, and we can't actually get to the point of where we're trying to get to unless we sort of band together and realize that we're making all this shit up as we go, and it is flawed and there's mistakes. And just being very open with this as much as we possibly can and help people along the way try to understand the world in a new and in a different way, rather than sort of beating up on those particular people. Now, we have to be also, as scientists and humans, have to be very open to the fact that we're all flawed, we're problematic, and we don't know what we're doing, and we're making things up, and it's really anxious, and it's really anxiety inducing, and we're all just this scared little 8-year-old kid that's standing in front of the classroom trying to make something up along the way, and realizing that those flaws are actually part of what's going on, and we have to be open to investigation along the way. And if somebody wants to sort of look at some of the stuff that you're doing, there's different techniques that you can get into to help them along the way. If you're a little bit scared of them getting into your work, and that's totally fine because the stuff that you have is proprietary, maybe you bring them on board and you sort of teach them and think them and help them develop a paper with you to understand what's going on with the particular context that you're looking at. And maybe that they're an expert and they're wanting to attack the particular work that you're working on. Well, then you bring them on board and you acknowledge that this is sort of problematic. And, if there's anything that they could do, that is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful advancement of science along the way. That's going to be very, very developmental, but both for you and the other person that is sort of on, that is sort of attacking that particular thing that you're getting at. The other thing that you do, and coming back to this problem that I had earlier this week where I was like, these numbers look really ridiculous. They don't make sense. This is highly unusual. You go back and you look at the stuff that you're doing and you realize, oh, wow, you know what? This is actually an insight where there is some knowledge being developed. And at that moment, I realized it wasn't a problem. What I was working on was not a problem. And in fact, it was a new way of thinking about the world, and it was a new context that I was thinking about the world. And I had to call, so I was working on some stuff with the medical device data I told you about. I actually called up the FDA and asked them what they thought what was going on, and they reinforced what I was thinking about, and actually became a much bigger and more important insight that I was actually working on than I could have done if I just ignored it and just said, well, this is the problem, it's problematic, and I can move forward. that was a wonderful learning experience for me. As I pointed out, we're making this stuff up as we go. We don't know what we're doing. And at that moment, I realized this is a moment where I can learn and I can understand something. Now, the problem was really tiny. It was just a one sort of control variable that I wasn't sort of I wasn't necessarily confident with, but then when I looked at that, I realized that this is a sort of a bigger insight that I normally would have thought about without doing that, and it adds a lot of richness to the scientific article that you actually have, the effort that you actually have, and you see the world in a different light. And I think that's how you can navigate this problem of making mistakes and people attacking the stuff that you're working on, is realize those two particular things. Make sure you're trying to be as humble as you possibly can, and realize that we're all making mistakes. We are not machines. I mean, this has been proven over and over and over again in the social sciences, particularly psychology and sociology. In my field, in organizational theory, it's a really big thing that we are not human. Even if we are not without making these mistakes. We always make mistakes. And even if you have a large lab, and I'm going to point this out, in my field in organizational theory, organizational sciences, we have shown repeatedly that people and organizations, large organizations, make mistakes along the way. There are problems, there's difficulties they have to deal with as all. So you have to be as humble and realize that we make mistakes, we're flawed, the things we're doing is highly subjective. There's all sorts of problems along the way. We just can't include all the information we possibly can include into every study. We can't be machines along the way. The other thing that you should really acknowledge is that you should be fairly open to investigation, and if there's somebody that's willing to help you out and push something forward, just like if somebody's willing to help me out with the reciprocity project, I'm going to welcome them. Obviously, you have to vet and think about what's going on behind the scenes and sort of look at who they are and work with them. But if anybody is willing to work on something like this with me and push this forward and continue to push this forward, they're free to, as long as there's discretion with the hiring and stuff like that. So that's all I wanted to say. I do appreciate everything that you're doing. And if you ever come across this as a researcher, as a scientist, as a scholar, that you made a mistake, please do leave a comment in the comment section talking about what you actually dealt with, how you actually sort of navigate this particular problem. I'd be really curious to find out how you all deal with mistakes with your own research, and coming up with these sort of errors and insights of how you actually deal with mistakes and deal with learning along the way. I do appreciate everything that you do. So that's it. Have a wonderful day and take care. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.